There is a place in southwestern New Mexico where the roads end and the wilderness begins, and the transition is so complete, so absolute, that it is possible to stand at the boundary of the two worlds and feel the difference not just as a change in geography, but as a change in time. Behind you, the highway, the small towns, the ranches, the fence lines, the particular human geometry of the modern American West. Ahead, something older. The land rises sharply into the Black Range and the Mogollon Mountains, folding itself into ridges and canyons and pine-covered slopes that stretch across more than 3 million acres of some of the most remote terrain remaining in the continental United States. The sky above this place is enormous. The distances are enormous. The silence, when the wind drops, is the kind of silence that exists only where human infrastructure has not yet arranged itself to fill every available moment with its particular noise. If you are settling in for a long evening, welcome. If you find value in these quiet journeys through the American past, a gentle like or subscription helps this channel continue its work. But there is no urgency here. We are going somewhere that rewards patience, a place where the canyon walls are measured in millions of years, and the human story, remarkable as it is, fits within the larger story of the land like a careful inscription in the margin of a very old book. This is the Gila Wilderness, the first formally designated wilderness area in the United States, set aside in 1924 through the advocacy of Aldo Leopold, who understood that some landscapes needed protection not from nature but from us. The Gila occupies a region of New Mexico that few people from outside the state could locate precisely on a map, and fewer still have visited. It sits in the southwestern corner of the state, roughly equidistant between the Arizona border and the Rio Grande. Bounded by the Gila River and its tributaries, defined by the volcanic geology of its mountains and the carved geology of its canyons, and distinguished from almost every other place in America by the depth of its remoteness. But the Gila Wilderness is not simply a place of natural grandeur. Beneath the pine forest, within the canyon walls, tucked into the volcanic cliffs above the Gila River, there are structures, rooms built of stone and mud, walls that have stood in some form for 7 or 8 centuries. Cliff dwellings pressed into the natural alcoves of the canyon walls, high above the river, placed with a precision and a purposefulness that reveals, in every carefully laid stone, the presence of people who knew this landscape deeply and built within it deliberately. And then there are the stories. Stories of passages, of tunnels, of underground spaces, of connections between the ruins that go deeper into the landscape than any visible wall or room. Some of these stories come from historical accounts, some from local tradition, some from the enthusiasm of explorers who wanted the wilderness to contain secrets commensurate with its scale. Separating what is real from what is legend, what is documented from what is imagined, and what the archaeology actually shows from what the stories promise, that is part of what this documentary is about. But before the structures, before the archaeology, before the stories of what may or may not lie beneath the surface, the landscape itself must be understood, because the Gila Wilderness is not simply a setting for an archaeological story. It is the reason the story exists at all. To understand the Gila Wilderness, it helps to begin not with the ruins, not with the archaeology, not even with the ancient people who built within this landscape, but with the land itself, as it was before any human hand had arranged a single stone within it. The geology of southwestern New Mexico is the geology of fire and time. The mountains that define the Gila region, the Mogollon Mountains, the Black Range, the Pinos Altos Range, are primarily volcanic in origin. Built from the eruptions and lava flows and ash deposits of a period of intense volcanic activity, that geologists associate with the formation of the Basin and Range Province, a broad zone of geological extension that stretches across the American Southwest and into Mexico. This extension, the literal pulling apart of the Earth's crust over millions of years, created the alternating pattern of mountain ranges and flat basins that defines the visual grammar of this part of the world. The volcanic rock of the Gila region is primarily rhyolite and tuff, the products of explosive volcanic eruptions that deposited enormous quantities of ash and volcanic material across the landscape. Tuff, in particular, is a rock type with significant consequences for the human story of this place, because tuff is soft enough to erode into the dramatic cliff faces and overhanging alcoves that made cliff-dwelling architecture possible. When wind and water work on tuff over thousands of years, they create hollows, shelters, and caves in the cliff faces, natural recesses in the rock that protected early human settlements from weather and from certain practical vulnerabilities that ground-level construction could not address. Without the particular geology of the Gila's volcanic rock, the cliff dwellings that remain the most visible and most remarkable human structures in the wilderness would not have been possible in their particular form. The Gila River itself is one of the defining features of the landscape. Rising in the mountains of the Gila Wilderness, it runs generally westward through New Mexico and into Arizona before eventually joining the Colorado River. In its upper reaches, within the wilderness, the Gila flows through the canyons it has carved over thousands of years, cutting down through the volcanic rock in a series of narrow gorges and broader valley sections that alternate as the geology and the gradient change. The river is not large by the standards of major American rivers. It is in many stretches a modest stream that can be waded across in low water periods, but it has shaped the landscape of the wilderness profoundly. And it was the river's presence that made sustained human settlement in this challenging environment possible. Water in the American Southwest is not a background condition. It is the organizing principle of everything. Where water is available, life clusters, plants, animals, and people. Where water is absent, the landscape is defined by its absence. The Gila River and its tributaries, the West Fork, the Middle Fork, the East Fork, and numerous smaller creeks, provided the ancient inhabitants of this region with water sources reliable enough to support communities whose architecture still stands within the canyon walls today. The canyon country carved by the Gila and its tributaries creates a microenvironment considerably different from the open desert basins below. The canyon floors support riparian vegetation, cottonwood and willow and sycamore, the plants that grow where water is close to the surface. The canyon walls provide shade at certain times of day. The temperatures in the deeper canyons are moderated compared to the open uplands. And the cliff faces of the canyon walls, eroded by water and weather into overhanging shelves and deep alcoves, provided the natural architectural possibilities that the canyon's ancient inhabitants recognized and used. Above the canyon country, the land rises into the pine and fir forests of the higher elevations. Ponderosa pine is the dominant tree of the middle elevations, a large and handsome tree that creates open, park-like forests on the better-drained slopes. Higher still, the forests become denser and darker, with Douglas fir and spruce occupying the cooler and wetter conditions of the high ridges. The ecological transition from desert scrub in the lowest valleys to alpine forest on the high peaks is one of the most dramatic vertical sequences in the American West. And it meant that ancient communities living near the Gila could access an unusually wide range of environments and resources within a relatively compact area. Wildlife moves through this landscape with a freedom that the surrounding managed and settled country no longer permits. Bears, mountain lions, deer, elk, javelinas, and a remarkable diversity of bird species, including the Mexican spotted owl, the zone-tailed hawk, and the elegant trogon, inhabit the Gila Wilderness in ways that reflect what the broader Southwest looked like before European settlement altered its ecology so thoroughly. The wilderness designation has, for a century now, protected this diversity by limiting the access and the kinds of activity that would otherwise have changed it. When you walk into the Gila Wilderness on any of its few maintained trails, the sense of entering a genuinely different world comes not from any single dramatic feature, but from the accumulation of small differences. The quality of the silence, the absence of visible human infrastructure. The feeling that the landscape has its own priorities that have nothing to do with human convenience or preference, the way the distances seem to expand as you move deeper into them. It is a landscape that rewards attention and resists hurry, and it is worth understanding in that way before the human story within it is introduced. Because the human story, when it comes, is intimately shaped by this landscape. The people who built within the Gila did not impose their architecture on a neutral backdrop. They read the landscape, its water, its stone, its sheltered places and exposed places, its seasonal rhythms, its resources and its challenges, and they built in response to what they read. Their structures make sense only in the context of the land that contains them, and the land makes more sense when understood as the environment within which those structures were created. Long before the canyons of the Gila River had any name in any human language, people were living within them. The human presence in the American Southwest extends back at least 13,000 years to the period following the last glacial maximum, when the first people were moving into and through the landscapes of the Americas. The Southwest of that period was different from what it is today, cooler and wetter, supporting plant and animal communities that no longer exist in the region. The large animals of the Pleistocene, mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, ancient bison, moved through a landscape that was grassier and more open than the desert terrain that eventually replaced it as the climate warmed and dried over the following millennia. The people who inhabited the ancient Southwest during the succeeding thousands of years adapted continuously to a landscape that was itself continuously changing. By the time we reach the period that archaeologists can document most fully, roughly the first millennium of the Common Era and the centuries immediately following, the southwestern United States supported a remarkable diversity of cultural traditions, each adapted to its particular ecological niche within the broader regional environment, in the area that includes the Gila Wilderness and the surrounding terrain. The most archaeologically significant ancient cultural tradition is that of the Mogollon people, a name applied by archaeologists to the communities that occupied the mountain and canyon country of what is now southwestern New Mexico and southeastern Arizona, from roughly the 3rd century of the Common Era through approximately the mid-15th century. The name Mogollon comes from the mountains where their archaeological remains are most visible, and it was applied by archaeologists as a convenience of classification, rather than as a term the people themselves used or recognized. The Mogollon tradition encompasses a broad range of community sizes, settlement patterns, architectural styles, and material cultures across its long history and wide geographic extent. Early Mogollon communities typically lived in semi-subterranean pit houses, dwellings dug partially into the ground, with pole and brush roofs, clustered in small groups near reliable water sources. These communities were relatively mobile, combining the cultivation of corn, beans, and squash with the hunting of game and the gathering of wild plant foods in a flexible strategy suited to the variable and often unpredictable conditions of the mountain southwest. Over the following centuries, Mogollon communities underwent significant changes. Settlement patterns shifted toward more permanent, above-ground masonry architecture. Villages became larger and more formally organized. Agricultural production intensified, tied to more sophisticated water management strategies that directed rainfall and runoff toward cultivated fields. The material culture, pottery in particular, became increasingly elaborate, culminating in the remarkable tradition known as Mimbers pottery, which combined geometric and figurative designs of considerable sophistication on ceramic bowls that have attracted scholarly attention, and unfortunately, the destructive interest of looters for well over a century. The Mimbers Valley, which lies to the east of the Gila Wilderness proper, was the center of one of the most archaeologically documented Mogollon traditions. The Mimbers people produced pottery between roughly 1000 and 1150 CE that is considered among the most artistically distinguished ceramic traditions in the ancient Americas. Their painted bowls depicted human figures, animals, insects, fish, and geometric patterns in a style that is immediately recognizable and that reveals, in its imagery, something of the intellectual and cultural life of the communities that produced it. Many Mimbers bowls were found in burial contexts, placed over the heads of the deceased with a deliberate hole, often called a kill hole, punched through the base, a practice whose specific meaning remains a matter of scholarly discussion. The communities associated with the Gila River Canyon country represent a somewhat different expression of Mogollon culture, one characterized by the cliff-dwelling architecture for which the region is best known today, and that reflects a particular and historically specific approach to settlement within the canyon environment. There is a specific moment in any approach to the cliff dwellings of the Gila that changes the experience from landscape observation to something more immediate. You are walking along the canyon floor, following the river or one of its tributaries, aware of the canyon walls rising above you on both sides, their volcanic tuff eroded into irregular forms by centuries of weathering. The canyon is narrow enough that the walls seem close, wide enough that the sky above is still fully present. Then something resolves in the cliff face, a regularity that does not belong to geology. Lines that are too straight, too deliberate, too precisely horizontal to be the work of erosion. A wall, then another wall. And behind the walls, rooms small, dark, opening into the cliff face, arranged along the ledge of a natural alcove in the tuff that the builders of those rooms understood and used as the back wall and partial roof of their settlement. The cliff dwellings of the Gila are the most visible legacy of the communities that lived in this canyon country, and they are genuinely remarkable, not for their scale, which is modest, compared to the great cliff settlements of Mesa Verde in Colorado or Canyon de Chelly in Arizona, but for their particular character, their relationship to the landscape, and what they reveal about the people who built them. The most well-known and best preserved of the Gila cliff dwellings are protected within the Gila Cliff Dwellings National Monument, established in 1907 and administered by the National Park Service. The monument encompasses a portion of the Gila Wilderness immediately adjacent to the confluence of the West Fork of the Gila River, and the cliff dwellings it protects occupy a series of natural caves in the canyon wall above the river, large alcoves eroded into the Gila tuff. Each one shaped somewhat differently by the particular pattern of erosion that created it, and each one used by the ancient inhabitants in ways that reflect both the natural dimensions of the alcove and the practical needs of the community that settled there. The dwellings were built primarily during the late 13th and early 14th centuries, a period roughly spanning from about 1275 to 1325 CE, based on the evidence available from tree-ring dating, ceramics, and other chronological indicators. They were occupied for what appears to have been a relatively brief period, perhaps a generation or two at most, before the community that built them relocated. The architecture itself, the construction quality, the layout of the rooms, the presence of hearth storage spaces, and evidence of daily domestic activity reflects a community with considerable skill and clear practical intelligence, not a mysterious or anonymous people, but a human community making sensible decisions about how to live in a particular environment at a particular moment in time. The rooms of the Gila cliff dwellings are built from the same volcanic tuff that forms the canyon walls, shaped into blocks and laid in courses with mud mortar. Some walls incorporate the natural surface of the alcove as a structural element, using the cave ceiling or back wall as the upper boundary of a room, reducing the amount of construction necessary and taking advantage of the natural shelter the alcove already provides. Doorways are small by modern standards, T-shaped openings in some cases, a form found across many Puebloan architectural traditions of the ancient Southwest, which may reflect practical considerations of heat retention, structural engineering, or cultural convention, and possibly some combination of all three. The arrangement of rooms within each alcove reflects deliberate spatial organization. Some rooms appear to have been used for domestic activities, cooking, sleeping, food preparation. Others were used for storage, their contents suggesting that the community accumulated and maintained food reserves in a way consistent with an agricultural economy subject to seasonal and interannual variability in rainfall and harvest. The presence of small, enclosed spaces, sometimes described as kivas in the archaeological literature, though their specific ceremonial function in the Gila context requires careful interpretation, suggests that some architectural spaces were reserved for community activities that went beyond the domestic. What the architecture reveals, more than any single feature, is a community that had thought carefully about how to inhabit this canyon. The placement of the dwellings in alcoves high above the canyon floor offered advantages that ground-level construction would not have provided protection from flooding, which in canyon environments can be sudden and severe. A degree of defensibility that elevated position naturally confers, and the natural shelter of the overhanging tuff, which moderated temperature and rainfall in ways that made the interior spaces more comfortable than exposed construction would have been. The choice of alcoves oriented to receive winter sunlight while providing shade in summer reflects a solar awareness that is visible in many ancient southwestern architectural traditions, and that represents a practical adaptation to a climate of considerable temperature variation. The view from the dwelling alcoves across the canyon is wide and commanding. The river below is visible. Movement in the canyon is observable from the dwellings in a way that movement within the dwellings is not observable from the canyon floor. Whether this defensive advantage was a primary consideration in site selection or simply a consequence of choosing elevated and sheltered alcoves for other reasons is a question that archaeologists have debated, and the honest answer is that the evidence does not settle the question definitively. Both practical shelter and spatial awareness were likely part of the calculation, in the way that good decisions in difficult environments tend to address multiple considerations simultaneously. Archaeology is, at its heart, an act of reading, and what makes it both compelling and humbling is that the text being read is always incomplete. The past does not preserve itself evenly. Some things survive, others do not. The things that survive are subject to interpretation, and interpretation is shaped by the questions being asked, the methods being used, and the conceptual framework within which researchers are working. Every generation of archaeologists reads the same ruins somewhat differently, because every generation brings different questions and different tools to the reading. The ruins of the Gila region have been studied archaeologically since the late 19th century, when the first systematic investigations of the cliff dwellings and surrounding sites were conducted. Adolf Bandelier, the Swiss-American archaeologist and historian, visited the Gila region in 1883 and produced one of the earliest written descriptions of the cliff dwellings from a scholarly perspective. His work, part of a broader project of documenting ancient sites across the American Southwest in the decades following the Civil War, helped establish the Gila cliff dwellings as a site of archaeological significance and contributed to the eventual movement toward their formal protection. Bandelier's investigations were followed by a succession of researchers over the following decades, each contributing something to the cumulative understanding of what the Gila ruins contained and what they represented. Early archaeological work in the region, conducted under conditions and with methodological standards that would not meet the requirements of modern archaeology, included excavations that recovered artifacts, established some chronological information, and provided descriptions of the architecture. Some of this early work also resulted in the removal of materials from sites in ways that permanently altered the archaeological contexts from which those materials came, a loss that modern archaeologists recognize as a limitation on what can now be known about those sites. More recent archaeological work in the Gila region has employed a wider range of methods and a more careful approach to the relationship between evidence and interpretation. Tree-ring dating, dendrochronology, has been particularly valuable in establishing the construction chronology of the cliff dwellings. Wood used in construction, when it survives, preserves a record of the annual growth rings of the tree from which it was cut, and those rings can be matched against regional chronologies that allow the year of cutting to be determined with considerable precision. The application of dendrochronology to the wooden elements of the Gila cliff dwellings has produced construction dates that anchor the occupation of the alcoves within a relatively narrow time window in the late 13th and early 14th centuries. Ceramic analysis, the study of pottery styles, manufacturing techniques, and the geographic distribution of specific ceramic types, provides another layer of chronological and cultural information. Different periods and different communities in the ancient Southwest produced pottery with distinctive characteristics, and the presence of particular ceramic types in a site can indicate the period of occupation, the cultural affiliations of the occupants, and the trade connections that brought materials from elsewhere into the community. The ceramics from the Gila cliff dwellings reflect the local Mogollon tradition, while also showing connections to contemporary ceramic traditions in neighboring regions, a pattern consistent with the broader picture of regional interaction and exchange that characterized the ancient Southwest. The spatial analysis of how rooms were arranged, how they were used, and how the settlement changed over time can reveal the social organization of the community that occupied the site, where storage rooms are concentrated, how large they are, and how they relate to domestic and communal spaces can suggest whether resources were managed communally or individually, whether social differentiation was expressed in architectural form, and whether the settlement pattern changed as the community grew or contracted over its period of occupation. What the archaeology of the Gila cliff dwellings consistently reveals is a community, or more precisely, a series of related communities that was sophisticated, pragmatic, and deeply adapted to the specific conditions of the canyon environment. The ruins are not the remnants of a mysterious or unknown people. They are the material record of communities whose descendants, in the view of many scholars and indigenous communities, are the Pueblo peoples of New Mexico and Arizona, whose cultural traditions have continued, in various forms, from the ancient period to the present day. This continuity between the people who built the Gila cliff dwellings and the living communities whose cultural traditions extend from that ancient past is one of the most important things to understand about the archaeology of this region. The cliff dwellings are not the remains of a vanished civilization. They are one chapter in the much longer story of the indigenous peoples of the Southwest, a story that did not end when the Gila sites were vacated in the early 14th century, but continued through migrations, consolidations, new settlements, and the complex history of the centuries that followed. The canyon country of the Gila does not reveal itself all at once. It offers itself gradually, in the way that complex things do, one view leading to another, one turn in the river exposing what the previous bend had concealed, one scramble up a tailless slope opening into a viewshed that the canyon floor had entirely hidden. To travel through the Gila Wilderness is to experience a landscape that seems to contain more than its visible surface suggests. The canyons are deeper than their approaches indicate. The cliffs are higher than they appear from the river. The forests on the high ridges above the canyons are invisible from within the canyon, and the canyon itself is invisible from the forest above, two entirely different environments occupying the same geographic space, accessible to each other only by the steep and rocky transitions of the canyon walls. This quality of a landscape that contains multiple worlds within itself, layered and interconnected, but not simultaneously visible, may partly explain why the Gila has attracted not only archaeologists and wilderness enthusiasts, but also a certain kind of storyteller drawn to the idea that the landscape contains hidden things. The ruins are one form of hiddenness, structures that were invisible to most of the outside world for centuries, known only to the communities that lived near them and the occasional traveler who came upon them unexpectedly. The canyons themselves are another form, places that the surrounding terrain conceals until you are within them. And then there are the caves. The volcanic geology of the Gila creates natural cave and rock shelter environments throughout the canyon country. Tuff erodes in ways that produce hollows and recesses in cliff faces, from small overhangs barely large enough for a person to shelter beneath, to the large alcoves that the cliff-dwelling communities used as the foundations for their architecture. Some of these natural spaces are easily visible from the canyon floor or from established trails. Others are tucked into cliff faces that require climbing to reach, hidden by vegetation or by the particular geometry of the canyon walls from any casual angle of observation. Beyond the cliff face alcoves, the Gila region contains natural caves formed by geological processes other than simple erosion. Some are associated with volcanic features, lava tubes, or collapse features related to the volcanic history of the region. Others are solution caves, where water has dissolved rock over long periods to create underground voids. The karst development in the region is not as extensive as in the limestone landscapes of the eastern United States, but it is present in some areas, and the natural cave features of the Gila have their own geological story to tell. These natural caves and rock shelters were not ignored by the ancient inhabitants of the Gila. Archaeological evidence indicates that many natural shelters in the region were used by people, sometimes for habitation, sometimes for storage, sometimes for activities that the archaeological evidence suggests, but does not always describe with full clarity. Smoke stains on cave ceilings, artifact deposits on cave floors. Evidence of prepared surfaces and structural modifications to natural spaces. All of these indicate that the ancient communities of the Gila understood the natural cave environment of their landscape and used it as part of the broader spatial repertoire of their settlement system. The distinction between a natural cave used by people, a natural cave modified by people, and a deliberately constructed underground space is a distinction that matters enormously when evaluating the claims and stories that have circulated about underground passages in the Gila region. These three categories of underground space are archaeologically, geologically, and historically very different from each other, even though they might all be described loosely as caves or tunnels by a casual observer unfamiliar with the specific evidence. Understanding the difference between them is essential to understanding what the archaeology of the Gila Wilderness actually shows and what it does not show. The caves of the Gila Wilderness did not wait for human beings to give them meaning. They formed over timescales that dwarf the entire span of human presence in the Americas, shaped by volcanic eruption, by the slow chemical work of water on rock, by the collapse of underground voids, by the patient erosion of cliff faces under the force of rain and wind, and the freeze-thaw cycles of high-elevation winters. They were here before the first people walked through these canyons, and they will be here long after whatever human chapter is currently being written in the landscape above them has concluded and passed into the geological record. But human beings, when they encountered these natural spaces, did what human beings consistently do with the features of the landscape they inhabit. They used them, they adapted them. They incorporated them into the logic of their settlement systems in ways that made practical and cultural sense, given the specific conditions of their lives. And in doing so, they left behind a record, sometimes faint, sometimes surprisingly detailed, of their engagement with the underground world of the Gila. To understand that record properly, it is necessary to spend some time with the geology that created the spaces in which it was left. The volcanic tuff of the Gila Wilderness is not a uniform material. It was deposited in episodes, from eruptions that varied in intensity, composition, and the character of the material they produced. Some layers of tuff are more resistant to erosion than others. Some layers are more permeable, allowing water to move through them and to dissolve or chemically alter the material in the process. The boundaries between different tuff layers, the contacts between eruption episodes separated by thousands or tens of thousands of years, are often zones of weakness where erosion preferentially works, undercutting harder layers above and leaving overhangs, ledges, and alcoves that express the particular stratigraphy of the volcanic sequence. This is the fundamental geological mechanism behind the cliff alcoves of the Gila, the natural recesses in the cliff face that the cliff-dwelling communities used as sheltered foundations for their architecture. The alcoves are not caves in the strict geological sense. They are open recesses, sheltered from above but not enclosed, formed by the differential erosion of volcanic layers rather than by solution chemistry or volcanic cavity formation. Their shape, depth, and character vary with the particular volcanic stratigraphy at each location along the canyon walls. True caves in the Gila region, enclosed underground spaces that extend horizontally or vertically into the rock, are less common than the open alcoves, but are present in several geological contexts. Where the volcanic rock has been fractured by faulting or by the stress associated with the region's long history of tectonic extension, fractures can provide pathways for water and create linear underground spaces that range from narrow cracks to passages wide enough for a person to move through. Where volcanic activity created lava tubes, tunnels formed within flowing lava as the outer surface cooled and solidified, while molten rock continued to flow beneath. The solidified shells of those tubes can survive as elongated underground passages long after the volcanic activity that created them has ceased. The Gila region has experienced enough volcanic activity over its geological history that the potential for lava tube features exists within parts of the landscape, though the extent and preservation of such features in the specific geology of the wilderness area is not uniformly documented. Lava tubes are found elsewhere in New Mexico. The El Malpais National Monument north of the Gila, for example, contains well-documented lava tube caves within its volcanic landscape, and the geological conditions that produce them are present in parts of the Gila's volcanic terrain as well. Additionally, where limestone or other soluble rock types occur within or adjacent to the predominantly volcanic geology of the region, and such occurrences exist in parts of the broader Gila country, the conditions for solution cave formation exist. Water moving through soluble rock over long periods can dissolve passages and chambers of varying size, creating the kind of karst cave environment more commonly associated with the limestone landscapes of other parts of the United States, but present here in a more limited and geologically complex form. The practical consequence of this geological diversity is that the underground world of the Gila Wilderness is not a single, uniform environment. It is a mosaic, a collection of different types of underground and semi-underground spaces, each created by different geological processes, each with its own character, and each used or not used by the ancient inhabitants of the region according to its particular accessibility, location, and usefulness. Archaeological evidence of human use of natural cave and rock shelter environments in the Gila region is documented and real. And it is worth examining in some detail, because it is precisely this documented evidence that distinguishes what we actually know about the underground spaces of the Gila from the stories and legends that have accumulated around the idea of hidden tunnels and secret passages. Natural rock shelters, the smaller alcoves, overhangs, and protected recesses in the canyon walls that did not form the basis for formal cliff-dwelling architecture, but that were used intermittently by people moving through the landscape, are among the most archaeologically common features of the Gila Canyon country. Their utility is obvious. A rock overhang provides shelter from rain and harsh sunlight. A shallow alcove in a cliff face gives protection from wind. A deep recess in a canyon wall can be used for food storage, where the stable temperature and low humidity help preserve dried agricultural products and gathered plant foods. The archaeological signatures of these uses are correspondingly varied. At some rock shelters, the evidence is minimal, perhaps a small scatter of stone flakes indicating that someone sat there and napped a tool, or the faint discoloration of the ceiling from a small fire. At others, the evidence is more substantial. Storage vessels, food remains, woven artifacts, painted or pecked images on the rock surfaces, and the accumulated debris of repeated use over many years or generations. Pictographs and petroglyphs, painted images and images carved or pecked into rock surfaces, are found at numerous locations throughout the Gila region, often in association with the sheltered and visually prominent rock faces that also attracted use as shelters and camps. The imagery is varied: geometric patterns, animal figures, human forms, handprints, and images that do not correspond clearly to any easily interpretable category. The cultural affiliation and specific meaning of many of these images is not established with certainty. And the honest position of archaeology is that while rock art can be dated in some cases, and its cultural context can often be inferred from associated artifacts and architectural features, the specific meanings or intentions behind particular images are not generally recoverable from the physical evidence alone. This honest uncertainty about meaning is important to state because rock art in the Gila region, as in many parts of the American Southwest, has sometimes been used by enthusiastic but methodologically unconstrained interpreters as evidence for claims that the archaeological mainstream does not support. Geometric patterns have been read as maps of tunnel systems. Figures have been interpreted as depicting underground journeys or subterranean worlds. Lines connecting dots have been proposed as indicating underground passages between sites. These interpretations are not supported by the rigorous standards of archaeological analysis, which requires that interpretive claims be grounded in independent lines of evidence that can be tested, compared, and evaluated. The artwork itself, however evocative, does not constitute documentation of underground passages. What the archaeological evidence of cave and rock shelter use in the Gila does document is a consistent pattern of human engagement with the natural underground environment of the canyon country, an engagement that was practical, flexible, and integrated into the broader settlement and subsistence strategy of the communities that lived here. People used the shelters that the landscape provided. They modified them where modification was useful. They stored things in them, camped in them, possibly conducted activities in them whose specific nature the evidence suggests, but does not always fully specify. This documented evidence of cave use is worth taking seriously on its own terms, not as a lesser alternative to a more dramatic story about hidden tunnels, but as a genuinely interesting record of how ancient communities related to the underground dimension of their landscape. The relationship between the cliff-dwelling communities of the Gila and the natural cave environment of their canyons was real, varied, and multidimensional, and it does not require elaboration or embellishment to be historically meaningful. There is a particular kind of story that attaches itself to remote and ancient landscapes, and it is worth examining honestly, because understanding where these stories come from is as important as evaluating what they claim. Stories of hidden tunnels, underground passages, and secret chambers beneath or within the ruins of the Gila Wilderness have circulated in various forms for well over a century. They appear in the accounts of early visitors to the region. They surface in the writings of explorers and adventurers who passed through the Gila country in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They persist in the oral traditions of local communities whose connection to the land predates formal archaeological investigation. And they have been amplified in recent decades by the internet, a medium that transmits claims of all kinds with equal efficiency regardless of their evidentiary foundation. The claims are not uniform. They range from relatively modest suggestions that some of the cliff-dwelling alcoves connect to deeper passages behind the visible architecture to considerably larger claims about extensive tunnel networks connecting multiple sites across the wilderness. To the most expansive versions that describe vast underground cities or chambers of treasures hidden beneath the Gila landscape. These different scales of claim rest on very different relationships to the available evidence, and they deserve to be examined at each level separately. At the most modest level, the suggestion that some natural caves or passages exist behind or beneath the visible cliff-dwelling structures. The claim is consistent with what geology and archaeology both indicate is possible. The tuff geology of the Gila Canyon walls does contain fractures, voids, and passages in various places. Some alcoves may be connected to deeper recesses in the cliff that are not immediately visible from the inhabited portions of the dwellings. Archaeological investigation of some cliff-dwelling sites has encountered spaces that were not initially apparent from surface observation. None of this is archaeologically controversial, and none of it requires a theory of deliberate tunnel construction to explain. Natural geological features within volcanic rock are expected, and their occasional presence behind or beneath built structures is entirely consistent with how cliff-dwelling communities incorporated natural features into their architecture. The historical accounts that contributed to the tunnel stories of the Gila are worth examining for what they actually said versus what they have been interpreted as saying in subsequent retellings. Some early visitors to the region described passages or chambers that they believed to be artificially constructed. Others described features that were clearly natural, caves, fissures, fractures in the rock, using language that was imprecise enough to be misread by later writers as evidence for deliberate construction. The difference between a natural passage in volcanic rock that humans used for storage or access and a deliberately excavated tunnel is significant archaeologically, but it is a distinction that casual observation and informal description do not always make clear. One category of historical account that has contributed to the tunnel legend involves the descriptions by early visitors of passages behind the back walls of cliff-dwelling rooms, spaces that appeared to extend into the cliff face beyond the visible architecture. Some such passages do exist at cliff-dwelling sites in the region, and their existence is not disputed. The question is what they are: natural geological features incorporated into the cliff-dwelling environment, or deliberately constructed passages serving a specific purpose. The archaeological evidence from sites where such features have been investigated tends to support the former interpretation. Natural voids and fractures in the tuff that were accessible from the dwellings used for storage or other purposes, but not systematically excavated or constructed as passageways in the way that the tunnel stories suggest. The larger-scale claims, extensive networks connecting multiple sites, underground chambers of significant size deliberately constructed by the ancient inhabitants, are not supported by the archaeological record of the Gila region. This is a strong statement, and it deserves explanation. Archaeological survey of the Gila Wilderness and the surrounding area has been extensive enough, and the sites within it have been investigated in sufficient detail. That a significant and systematic tunnel network of the kind sometimes described in popular accounts would almost certainly have left evidence that has not been found. Excavations at major sites have not encountered the construction evidence. The cut stone, the shaped passages, the bracing and lining that deliberately constructed tunnels require, that would be expected if such tunnels existed as built features. This absence of evidence is not proof of absence in any absolute sense. Archaeological survey of any landscape as large and complex as the Gila Wilderness is necessarily incomplete, and it is always possible that features exist that have not yet been encountered. But the responsible position, the position that the available evidence supports, is that the claims of extensive, deliberately constructed tunnel networks beneath the Gila are not archaeologically confirmed, and that the available evidence does not provide a basis for treating those claims as established fact. Every responsible investigation of a historical mystery eventually arrives at a point where the evidence must be stated plainly, where the accumulation of stories, claims, and atmospheric suggestion must be measured against what systematic research has actually found. The archaeology of the Gila Wilderness supports the following conclusions with reasonable confidence. The ancient communities associated with the Mogollon tradition, and specifically the cliff-dwelling communities of the Gila River Canyon country, were sophisticated, skilled, and deeply adapted to the canyon environment they inhabited. Their architecture represents a genuine achievement of design and construction, an achievement made more remarkable by the challenging conditions under which it was accomplished and the specific environmental problems it was designed to address. These communities used the natural underground spaces of their landscape, the rock shelters, the alcoves, the caves, as part of an integrated settlement and subsistence system. The evidence of this use is real, varied, and distributed across numerous sites throughout the canyon country. The cliff-dwelling communities occupied the Gila Canyon alcoves for a relatively brief period, perhaps a few decades, perhaps somewhat longer, in the late 13th and early 14th centuries before relocating. The reasons for this relocation are not fully established by the evidence, but they almost certainly reflect the complex interplay of environmental, social, and demographic factors that characterized the ancient Southwest during a period of significant regional change. The Gila cliff dwellings are connected, culturally and historically, to the living Pueblo communities of New Mexico and Arizona. The descendants of the people who built these structures continue to maintain cultural traditions that extend from the ancient period to the present. What the archaeology does not confirm is a deliberate system of constructed underground passages connecting sites within the wilderness, or chambers of significant size excavated beneath the cliff-dwelling structures as deliberate architectural features. The evidence for these specific claims is not established in the archaeological literature, and the most responsible interpretation of the available information is that the tunnel stories of the Gila reflect a combination of genuine natural geological features, imprecise historical descriptions, and the natural human tendency to imagine hidden significance in remote and ancient landscapes. This is not a dismissal of the stories themselves as cultural phenomena. The stories are real, even when the specific things they describe are not archaeologically confirmed. Stories of hidden passages and underground chambers in ancient landscapes tell us something about how human beings relate to the past, about the desire to believe that the land contains more than its visible surface reveals, that the people of earlier times possessed knowledge or capabilities that we have lost or failed to understand. This desire is not irrational. It reflects a genuine intuition that the past is more complex and more interesting than the simplified versions of it that are easily available. The problem is not the intuition, but the specific claims that are sometimes built on it, claims that go beyond what the evidence supports and that can, in their more extreme forms, displace rather than illuminate genuine understanding. The genuine history of the Gila Wilderness, the documented archaeology. The known architectural achievements, the real ecological relationships, the actual story of community life and adaptation and eventual relocation, is interesting enough and complex enough and still sufficiently incomplete in its details that it does not need the addition of unsupported mystery to hold attention. The ruins of the Gila cliff dwellings, understood on their own terms, are as compelling as any romanticized version of them. To look at the cliff dwellings of the Gila from the canyon floor is to see architecture in conversation with geology, a dialogue between what human hands built and what geological time had already created, in which the geological partner is the larger and older contributor by an enormous margin. The volcanic tuff, into which the cliff-dwelling alcoves are eroded, was deposited during a period of intense volcanic activity associated with the formation of the Mogollon volcanic field, a large igneous province that produced multiple episodes of caldera-forming eruptions between roughly 40 and 24 million years ago. The calderas associated with this volcanic episode are among the largest known volcanic features in North America, and the vast quantities of volcanic material they produced, ash flows, pumice deposits, lava flows, covered and buried the landscape of southwestern New Mexico to considerable depth. The tuff that forms the canyon walls of the Gila today is the eroded remnant of those eruption deposits, exposed by millions of years of canyon cutting by the Gila River and its tributaries. The specific type of tuff most important to the cliff-dwelling story is welded tuff, a material formed when volcanic ash is deposited at high temperature and welds together under its own weight and heat into a coherent rock mass. Welded tuff has a characteristic structure. It is generally dense enough to be carved and shaped by human tools. It erodes in ways that create the vertical cliff faces and overhanging alcoves that characterize the Gila Canyon walls. And it provides material that the cliff-dwelling builders used directly in constructing their rooms. Many of the buildings' stones visible in the Gila cliff-dwelling walls were quarried from the same tuff that forms the alcove in which the walls stand, a local material extracted from the immediate geological context and shaped for construction. The erosional behavior of the tuff is controlled by the layering within it, the boundaries between individual eruption deposits, each with its own composition and physical properties. More resistant layers protect softer material below, creating the horizontal shelves and overhanging ledges that are the characteristic form of the Gila Canyon walls. Less resistant layers erode preferentially, creating the recesses and hollows that the cliff-dwelling communities recognized as potential building sites. The geometry of these erosional features, their depth, their height, their orientation relative to the sun and the prevailing weather, determined which alcoves were architecturally useful and which were not. And the distribution of cliff-dwelling sites in the Gila Canyon corresponds closely to the distribution of suitable alcoves created by the particular erosional history of the canyon walls. Beneath the tuff, the geological story continues. The volcanic sequence rests on older rock, Paleozoic sedimentary formations, and Precambrian basement that represents a much earlier chapter in the geological history of the region. These older rocks are exposed in some parts of the Gila country, particularly in the deeper canyon incisions where the river has cut through the volcanic cover into the older material beneath. The contact between the volcanic tuff and the underlying sedimentary or metamorphic rocks is in some places a zone of geological complexity where different rock types with different properties are in contact, and where the differential behavior of those rock types in response to water and stress can create fractures, voids, and other structural features in the rock. This geological complexity, the layered volcanic sequence, the older rocks beneath, the fractures and faults that crosscut the entire package, is the geological reality within which any naturally occurring underground spaces in the Gila must be understood. The underground geometry of the Gila is not simple. It is complex, varied, and incompletely mapped, in the way that the underground geology of most mountain terrains is complex and incompletely mapped. The existence of natural voids, fractures, and passages within this geological complexity is expected and unremarkable from a geological perspective. What matters for the historical and archaeological story is not simply whether underground spaces exist, they do in various forms, but what those spaces are, how they formed, and what relationship they have, if any, to the ancient human communities that lived above them. Water shaped this landscape in ways that are still visible in its every canyon and cliff, and water, was the central organizing fact of human life within it. The Gila River, for all its modest size in the modern diminished state to which diversions and drought have reduced it, was historically a more substantial presence in the canyon country of the wilderness. The river and its tributaries provided reliable water in a landscape where reliable water was the limiting factor for sustained human habitation. The communities that built the cliff dwellings of the Gila Canyon were essentially anchored to the river system, located within reach of its water, dependent on it for drinking and for the irrigation or floodwater farming that supplemented their dry-farmed crops on the canyon bottoms and the upland terraces. The management of water by ancient southwestern communities was sophisticated well before the cliff-dwelling period, and the communities of the Gila region participated in this broader tradition of water engineering. Check dams, small stone structures built across minor drainages to slow runoff and encourage infiltration, are found throughout the Gila country in locations that suggest deliberate placement to maximize the agricultural benefit of seasonal rainfall. Terraces on hill slopes above the canyon bottoms indicate efforts to slow erosion and retain soil moisture in fields distant from the river. The spatial distribution of these water management features across the landscape reveals a community whose understanding of local hydrology was detailed and practical. Underground water, the springs that emerge from cliff faces and canyon walls where permeable rock layers allow groundwater to reach the surface, was also part of the hydrological landscape that ancient communities in the Gila used. Springs in canyon environments are often associated with the contacts between rock layers of different permeability, where water moving through a permeable zone encounters an impermeable barrier and is forced to the surface. The tuff geology of the Gila creates conditions for this kind of spring emergence in places where different eruption layers with different porosities are in contact. And springs in the canyon walls would have been known and valued by the cliff-dwelling communities for whom proximity to water was a practical necessity. The relationship between underground water and the cave and passage features of the Gila geology is a real one. Water moving through the rock creates the fractures and dissolution features that become natural passages and voids. Springs are, in essence, the surface expression of underground water movement, the point where the hidden hydrological world of the rock intersects with the visible world of the canyon. The ancient communities of the Gila lived at this intersection daily. Their understanding of where water emerged from the rock and why was likely more detailed and more practical than any generalized description from the outside can capture. This intimate knowledge of local hydrology, of where the water was, how it moved, where it could be found reliably and where it could not, represents another dimension of the sophisticated adaptation that the cliff-dwelling communities of the Gila demonstrated in their relationship to the canyon landscape. They knew this country in the way that people know a place they have lived in for generations, not abstractly, not through maps or measurements, but through accumulated observation and experience passed from one generation to the next across the long continuity of community life. At some point in the early 14th century, the cliff dwellings of the Gila Canyon fell quiet. The hearths cooled. The storage rooms, whatever they still contained, were left behind or emptied by the departing community. The carefully laid stone walls, the mud-plastered surfaces, the wooden roof beams, all of the architecture that had taken considerable effort and skill to construct, were abandoned to the slow work of time, weather, and the gradual settling of the canyon into its own geological patience. We do not know exactly when the last person walked out of the Gila cliff dwellings and did not return. We do not know whether the departure was sudden or gradual, whether it followed a single decision made by a community, or whether it was the accumulated result of individual and family choices made over several years. We do not know whether the people who left understood their departure as permanent or whether they imagined returning, whether they left things behind because they expected to come back for them or because carrying them was not practical, or because those things had simply lost their usefulness in whatever new situation awaited the community at its destination. What the archaeological record can tell us is that the occupation of the Gila cliff dwellings was relatively brief by the standards of ancient southwestern settlement. The tree ring and ceramic evidence points to a period of use spanning roughly a generation or two in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, and that the departure, whenever it occurred, was not followed by reoccupation of the same sites by the same community. The cliff dwellings were not abandoned and then reused in an extended cycle of occupation and abandonment. They were built, occupied for a period, and then left, and the architectural record that survives today reflects that single episode of use rather than a long, layered history of multiple occupations. This pattern, brief, concentrated occupation followed by permanent departure, is not unusual in the ancient Southwest during the period in question. The late 13th century was a time of significant disruption across the entire Southwest. A period that archaeologists have documented through the convergence of multiple lines of evidence: tree ring records, pollen analysis, archaeological site distributions, ceramic evidence of population movement, and the remains of agricultural systems that show evidence of stress and failure across wide areas of the region. The late 1200s brought a prolonged and severe drought to the Colorado Plateau and the surrounding Southwest, a drought documented in the tree ring record with a precision that is unusual for events of this antiquity. The Great Drought, as it is sometimes called in the archaeological literature, lasted from approximately 1276 to 1299 CE, and its effects on agricultural communities whose food security depended on the reliability of summer rainfall were profound. Communities in drought-affected areas faced not merely reduced harvests, but the progressive degradation of soils, the failure of water management systems designed for normal rather than extreme conditions, and the collapse of the social and economic arrangements that sustained community life in good years. The cliff-dwelling communities of the Gila Canyon would not have been entirely immune to these regional pressures. Even in a canyon environment with a reliable river, the broader agricultural and economic systems within which these communities operated were connected to a wider regional network that was itself under stress. Trade relationships that normally brought materials, ideas, and people through the community would have been disrupted if neighboring communities were themselves struggling. The social connections that linked the Gila communities to other groups across the region, the marriages, the ritual relationships, the exchange networks, would have been strained by the broader difficulties of the period. At the same time, the Gila Canyon environment offered some protection against the worst effects of regional drought. The river provided water even in dry years. The canyon microclimate supported agricultural production in conditions that would have been prohibitive on the open uplands. The specific resources of the canyon, the riparian vegetation, the game that gathered near the water, the wild plant foods that persisted in the canyon margins even when upland resources failed, gave canyon communities a degree of resilience that purely upland communities did not have. This resilience may explain, at least in part, why the Gila cliff dwellings were built when they were, in the late 1270s and 1280s, in the early years of the Great Drought, and why they were occupied for as long as they were. Communities moving into the canyon environment during a period of regional stress may have been seeking precisely the resource advantages that the canyon offered, consolidating near the river as conditions in the surrounding landscape deteriorated. But consolidation of this kind creates its own stresses. Larger populations in smaller areas put more pressure on local resources. Agricultural intensification in canyon bottoms can lead to soil degradation and flooding damage over time. Social tensions within communities under external pressure may make the management of shared resources more difficult. The archaeology of cliff-dwelling sites across the southwest during this period shows evidence of communities navigating these internal stresses, as well as the external pressures of drought and regional disruption. The departure from the Gila cliff dwellings was not an ending. It was a movement, a relocation within a landscape that the people who left the canyons still inhabited, still knew, and still maintained cultural and social connections to. The question of where the Gila cliff-dwelling communities went when they left the canyon is one that archaeologists have worked to answer through the careful tracking of ceramic traditions, architectural styles, and other material culture markers that can indicate the movement of people and ideas across the landscape. The answer, as with most archaeological questions of this kind, is not a simple one. The late 13th and early 14th centuries saw population movements across the entire Southwest, a broad reorganization of communities that had been distributed across the landscape in smaller, more dispersed settlements into larger, more concentrated aggregations in specific locations. The great Pueblo towns of the Rio Grande Valley, the communities that were encountered by Spanish explorers in the 16th century and whose descendants continue to occupy the region today, were largely established during this period of regional reorganization. Communities from the Colorado Plateau, from the Mogollon Highlands, from the canyon country of the central Southwest, contributed to the formation of these larger aggregated towns through a series of migrations and consolidations that unfolded over several generations. The ceramic evidence is particularly instructive. The pottery traditions of the Gila cliff-dwelling communities show connections to the broader Mogollon tradition and to the specific local developments of the Gila region, and those connections can be traced in the ceramic assemblages of later sites further east and north along the Rio Grande and its tributaries. The disappearance of a ceramic style from one area and its appearance, in modified form, in another area is not proof of population movement, but when multiple lines of evidence point in the same direction, the inference becomes more robust. The Pueblo communities of the Rio Grande region, the Zuni, the Hopi, the communities of the eastern Pueblos maintain oral traditions and cultural knowledge that connect them to the ancient sites of the broader Southwest, including the canyon country of the Gila. From the perspective of these living communities, the story of the ancient Southwest is not a story of mysterious disappearance, but a story of movement and continuity, of communities that relocated, regrouped, and rebuilt their social and cultural life in new places while maintaining connections to the landscapes and histories they had left behind. This perspective matters for how the story of the Gila cliff dwellings is told. The Western archaeological tradition, through much of its history, has tended to frame the abandonment of ancient sites as a mystery requiring explanation, as though the absence of people from a specific place is the primary thing to be understood. From the perspective of indigenous communities whose traditions connect them to those ancient sites, the movement itself is not the mystery. Movement was a normal and expected part of life in the ancient Southwest, a rational response to changing conditions in a landscape that demanded flexibility and adaptation. The mystery, if there is one, is not why people left, but how they navigated the complex social and environmental landscape of a period that required so much of them. The Gila cliff dwellings, in this framing, are not a monument to a disappeared people. They are evidence of a period in the long history of communities that continue to exist, a period of particular adaptation to a particular environment under particular conditions that produced a particular architectural achievement before the conditions changed and the community moved on. The cliff dwellings are remarkable. The people who built them were more remarkable still, and their story did not end when they walked away from the canyon. The canyon country of southwestern New Mexico entered the written historical record of the European colonial period gradually and incompletely, a reflection of the remoteness of the terrain, the difficulty of travel through the mountains and canyons, and the limited interest that Spanish colonial authorities initially showed in a region that did not obviously contain the mineral wealth or the large sedentary populations that made other parts of New Spain more immediately attractive to colonial exploitation. The Spanish exploration of the American Southwest began in earnest in the 1540s when Francisco Vázquez de Coronado led a large expedition northward from Mexico in search of the mythical 7 cities of gold, rich cities that Spanish informants described in terms that proved on investigation to have been considerably inflated. Coronado's expedition reached the Pueblo communities of the Rio Grande Valley and the Hopi towns of what is now Arizona, encountering living communities that were the descendants and cultural relatives of the people who had, 2 centuries earlier, inhabited the cliff dwellings of the Gila Canyon. The expedition did not penetrate the specific canyon country of the Gila Wilderness in any well-documented way, and the cliff dwellings themselves, already long abandoned by the time of Coronado's journey, were not a feature of the Spanish colonial encounter with the region. Subsequent Spanish exploration and eventual colonization of New Mexico, culminating in the formal establishment of the colony of New Mexico in 1598 under Juan de Oñate, brought Spanish authority and cultural influence into sustained contact with the Pueblo communities of the Rio Grande region. The southwestern corner of the territory, the area that includes the Gila country, remained peripheral to the main centers of colonial activity, which were concentrated in the Rio Grande Valley, where the larger Pueblo towns were located, and where Spanish missionaries and civil authorities established their principal presence. The Apache peoples, the various groups known collectively to the Spanish as the Apache, speakers of southern Athabascan languages who had moved into the southwest from northern regions in the centuries before European contact, became significant actors in the history of the Gila country during the Spanish colonial period and into the American territorial era. The Western Apache, and particularly the group known as the Chiricahua Apache, inhabited the mountain and canyon country of southwestern New Mexico and southeastern Arizona, using the terrain of the Gila region in ways consistent with a highly mobile, wide-ranging way of life that combined hunting, gathering, raiding, and trade in a flexible economic strategy well-suited to the difficult landscape. The Apache relationship to the Gila Wilderness, the deep knowledge of its terrain, its water sources, its hiding places, and escape routes through the canyons, shaped the history of the region through the American territorial period and into the late 19th century when the final conflicts between Apache communities and the United States military were played out in part within this landscape. Geronimo, the Chiricahua Apache leader, whose resistance to American authority made him a historical figure of considerable notoriety in his own time, knew the Gila country intimately. The canyons and mountains of the wilderness were part of the terrain within which he and his followers moved, evaded pursuit, and maintained their resistance for longer than any American military planner had anticipated. The Apache knowledge of the Gila landscape, its passages, its water sources, its hidden approaches and concealed campsites, is sometimes invoked in discussions of the tunnel legends of the region. The Apache used the terrain so effectively and seemed to disappear so completely into the landscape when pursued that stories of hidden passages and underground escape routes became part of the popular explanation for military evasion that was, in reality, the product of deep landscape knowledge and exceptional tactical skill. Whether any specific underground passages were used by Apache groups in the Gila, or whether the stories of tunnels associated with Apache evasion are themselves a kind of legend generated by the failure of American military forces to track and contain a mobile and terrain-skilled opponent, is not clearly established by the historical evidence. What the historical record does establish is that the Gila country was intimately known by the people who lived within it, the Apache communities who inhabited it in the centuries before American military conquest, in a way that no outside observer, however skilled, could easily replicate. That depth of landscape knowledge was itself a form of hidden advantage that required no literal underground passage to explain. The arrival of American territorial authority in New Mexico following the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848 set in motion a series of changes in the Gila country that unfolded over the following decades. Changes in land use, land ownership, resource extraction, and the relationships between the region's different human communities that permanently altered the character of the landscape. Mining activity in the Pinos Altos Mountains adjacent to the Gila country began in the 1860s, drawing prospectors and settlers into terrain that had previously been largely outside the sphere of American settlement. The silver and copper deposits of the region attracted investment and population, and the small communities that grew up around the mining operations. Silver City, being the most significant and most enduring, created a new pattern of human presence in the southwestern New Mexico landscape. The mining era brought not only miners, but also the particular culture of the American frontier west, the prospectors who combed the canyons and mountains looking for mineral wealth, who noted unusual geological features, who explored cave and passage systems in the course of their prospecting, and who generated stories and reports about what they found or believed they found in the underground world of the Gila country. Some of the earliest written accounts of underground features in the Gila region come from this mining and prospecting era, and they reflect the particular interests and interpretive framework of men who were professionally focused on what lay beneath the surface of the ground, who understood caves and passages when they encountered them primarily through the lens of geological and mineral potential. The prospecting culture of the American frontier also contributed to a broader tradition of buried treasure stories and hidden riches legends that attached themselves to remote and ancient landscapes across the West. The combination of ancient ruins, inaccessible terrain, and a mining culture already attuned to the possibility of hidden wealth beneath the surface created conditions favorable to the generation of tunnel and treasure legends. Stories of Spanish treasure hidden in the Gila, of Apache caches concealed in canyon passages, of ancient chambers containing materials of extraordinary value. All of these are part of a broader legend tradition that is common to many remote and historically layered landscapes in the American Southwest. These legends are not without interest. They reflect genuine historical relationships, the Spanish colonial presence in the broader region, the Apache resistance, and the use of the terrain, the ancient archaeological sites that any observant traveler in the Gila would encounter. But the legend tradition distorts and embellishes these real historical elements, combining them with wishful thinking about hidden wealth and exotic mystery in ways that produce narratives far more dramatic than the historical evidence supports. The formal archaeological investigation of the Gila cliff dwellings began in this same period of increased American engagement with the region. Adolf Bandelier's 1883 visit, already mentioned, was part of a broader wave of archaeological investigation of southwestern sites that the Smithsonian Institution and other scientific bodies sponsored in the late 19th century. Bandelier was followed by other researchers in the early 20th century. And the designation of the Gila Cliff Dwellings National Monument in 1907, within the broader national forest framework that was beginning to establish federal management of public lands in the region, provided institutional support for the protection and investigation of the most significant archaeological sites. The establishment of the Gila Wilderness in 1924 through the advocacy of Aldo Leopold and the cooperation of the United States Forest Service extended protection across a much larger area of the landscape, not with the specific purpose of archaeological protection, though that was among the benefits, but with the broader goal of preserving a significant expanse of roadless wild land from the mechanized development that was rapidly transforming other parts of the American West. Leopold understood the Gila Wilderness as an experiment, the first formal test of whether the federal government could commit to preserving a large landscape in its wild state as a matter of deliberate policy rather than simply as the accidental result of inaccessibility. The experiment succeeded, and the Gila Wilderness became the model for the National Wilderness Preservation System that the Wilderness Act of 1964 subsequently established. The wilderness designation has had direct consequences for the archaeological resources within the Gila. The restriction of mechanized access has slowed the pace of site deterioration from visitor impact and has made large-scale looting more difficult, though by no means impossible. The remoteness of the wilderness has also limited the scale of formal archaeological investigation. Fieldwork in the Gila requires significant logistical effort, and the sites most accessible to researchers are not always the most scientifically important ones. The vast majority of the archaeological sites within the wilderness, the rock shelters, the open-air campsites, the agricultural features, the rock art locations, the surface scatters of pottery and stone tools that indicate ancient human presence across the landscape, have not been systematically excavated and are known. Where they are known at all from surface survey rather than subsurface investigation. The Gila Wilderness is not a museum. It is not a preserved snapshot of some earlier moment in the history of the American Southwest. It is a living landscape, one that has been continuously changing since the ancient cliff-dwelling communities walked away from their canyon alcoves in the early 14th century, and that continues to change today under the influence of climate ecological dynamics, fire, and the complex management decisions that the Forest Service makes in attempting to balance wilderness values with practical realities. Fire is one of the most powerful ecological forces in the Gila landscape, and its role in shaping the wilderness has been significant both in the ancient past and in the more recent history of the region. The ponderosa pine forests of the Gila have a natural fire regime that involves frequent, low-intensity surface fires that clear the understory without killing the large trees. This regime was maintained over thousands of years by the combination of lightning ignition and, in all likelihood, deliberate burning by the indigenous communities who inhabited the landscape, burning conducted to improve grazing for game animals, to clear agricultural land, to maintain travel corridors, and for other purposes consistent with the active landscape management that many ancient southwestern communities practiced. The suppression of fire in the 20th century disrupted this natural and culturally maintained fire regime, allowing the accumulation of fuels in the Gila forests that has made subsequent fires more severe and more difficult to manage. Large wildfires have burned through portions of the Gila Wilderness in recent decades, creating the mosaic of burned and recovering forest that is visible from the ridge tops, a landscape in a state of ecological transition that reflects both the long history of fire as a shaping force in this environment and the more recent consequences of its suppression. For the archaeological sites within the wilderness, fire presents a complex set of challenges. High-intensity fires can damage or destroy the organic materials, wood, charcoal, plant remains, that provide some of the most valuable chronological and environmental information about ancient sites. They can destabilize architectural features by thermally shocking the stone and mortar of cliff-dwelling walls. They can cause erosion by removing the vegetation that holds soil in place, exposing buried archaeological materials to accelerated weathering and displacement. At the same time, fire can clear vegetation from around sites, making them more visible to survey teams, and the burned landscapes that follow large fires sometimes reveal archaeological features that were previously hidden by dense vegetation. The hydrology of the Gila has also changed significantly since the ancient period. The Gila River, in its upper reaches within the wilderness, runs through a landscape where the removal of beaver, which were extensively trapped during the fur trade era of the 19th century, has altered the structure of the riparian environment. Beaver dams created wetlands and slowed the movement of water through the canyon system in ways that enhanced the agricultural potential of the canyon bottoms and supported a more diverse riparian ecosystem than the modern river maintains. The reintroduction of beaver to parts of the Gila system in recent years has been one of the restoration efforts aimed at recovering some of the ecological function that their removal destroyed. Climate change adds a further layer of uncertainty to the future of the Gila landscape. The American Southwest is one of the regions of the world where climate models project the most significant increases in temperature and aridity over the coming decades. And the Gila, already a landscape where water availability is the fundamental limiting factor for both ecological and human systems, is correspondingly vulnerable to the changes that those projections suggest. The parallels between the current trajectory of southwestern climate and the conditions of the late 13th century, the period of the Great Drought that is associated with the abandonment of cliff-dwelling sites across the region, are not lost on researchers who study both the ancient and the contemporary Southwest. The ancient communities of the Gila navigated a period of significant climate stress through a combination of agricultural adaptation, social reorganization, and geographic movement. Whether the contemporary landscape and its human communities have the flexibility to navigate the climate changes ahead in ways that preserve the ecological and archaeological values of the wilderness is a question that the evidence of the ancient past can inform, though not answer. The archaeology of the Gila Wilderness in the 21st century looks considerably different from the investigations that Adolf Bandelier conducted in the 1880s, and the difference is not simply a matter of better tools or more sophisticated methods, though both of those things are true. The difference runs deeper than technology. It reflects a fundamental change in how archaeologists understand their relationship to the landscapes they study, to the sites they investigate, and to the living communities whose histories are embedded in the ancient record they work to understand. Modern archaeological practice in the American Southwest is shaped profoundly by the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990, a federal law that established the rights of indigenous communities to claim ancestral human remains, funerary objects, and objects of cultural patrimony that had been collected by museums, universities, and federal agencies over the preceding century of archaeological investigation. The law changed the relationship between archaeologists and indigenous communities from one of extraction, in which archaeologists removed materials from ancestral sites and deposited them in institutions that indigenous communities had no authority over, to one of consultation, collaboration, and in many cases, genuine partnership. For the Gila Wilderness, the implementation of this changed relationship has involved consultation with the Pueblo communities of New Mexico and Arizona, whose cultural traditions connect them to the ancient sites of the region, the Zuni Pueblo, the Hopi tribe, and the various eastern Pueblo communities along the Rio Grande. These consultations have added dimensions to the archaeological understanding of the Gila sites that purely material culture analysis could not provide, perspectives on what spaces were significant, what practices may have been associated with particular architectural forms, and how the movement of communities through the landscape should be understood within a cultural framework rather than simply as a response to environmental pressure. The physical methods of modern archaeology have also expanded significantly since the early 20th century. Remote sensing technologies, including aerial and satellite imagery, LiDAR surveying, and ground-penetrating radar, can now identify archaeological features and subsurface anomalies that would have required extensive ground-level survey or excavation to detect in the past. LiDAR, which uses laser pulses to create extremely detailed topographic models of the ground surface, has been transformative in heavily vegetated landscapes, where the forest canopy previously obscured the fine-scale topographic signatures of ancient agricultural terraces, check dams, and other features that would be invisible to aerial photography but detectable in detailed elevation data. Ground-penetrating radar, a technology that sends electromagnetic pulses into the ground and records the reflections from subsurfaces at different depths, has been used at various archaeological sites to investigate subsurface features without excavation. The technique can detect buried walls, floors, pits, and other architectural features, as well as significant changes in soil density and composition that may indicate buried deposits. It has obvious relevance to the question of underground features in the Gila, and it is worth noting that in cases where ground-penetrating radar has been applied to sites where tunnel legends circulate, the results have generally not supported the existence of the extensive constructed passages that the legends describe. The technology is not infallible, and it works better in some geological contexts than others, but it provides an empirical check on claims about subsurface features that previous generations of investigators did not have access to. Isotopic analysis of human skeletal remains, when such remains exist, and when their investigation is authorized through appropriate consultation with descendant communities, can reveal information about the diet, mobility, and geographic origins of individuals buried at archaeological sites. Strontium and oxygen isotopes in tooth enamel, for example, record the geochemical signature of the water and food consumed during childhood and comparison of those signatures with the signatures of different geographic areas can indicate whether an individual was born in the place where they were buried or had moved there from elsewhere. This kind of mobility data can directly address questions about the movement of people between sites, questions that are central to understanding the dynamics of cliff-dwelling occupation and the patterns of departure that followed. Genetic analysis of ancient DNA extracted from skeletal remains with appropriate care and authorization has begun to add a biological dimension to the understanding of population movements in the ancient Southwest, complementing the ceramic and architectural evidence with information about biological relationships between communities at different sites and in different periods. This line of research is scientifically powerful but also ethically complex, given the relationship between genetic data and indigenous identity, and it proceeds most responsibly in the context of partnership with the communities whose ancestors are being studied. The cumulative picture that emerges from these modern investigative approaches is one of a landscape far more densely and continuously inhabited in the ancient period than the surviving architectural record alone suggests. The cliff dwellings are the most visible and most dramatic evidence of human presence in the Gila, but they represent only a portion, probably a small portion, of the total archaeological record. The open-air sites, the agricultural features, the rock shelter camps, the rock art locations. The water management structures scattered across the canyon country. All of these contribute to a picture of ancient human life in the Gila that was more varied, more extensive, and more intimately connected to every part of the landscape than the cliff-dwelling sites alone could convey. The protection of archaeological sites in a large wilderness area is a challenge that has no entirely satisfactory solution, only a set of imperfect tools and ongoing commitments that must be maintained indefinitely against the combined pressures of time, weather, and human behavior. The Gila Wilderness covers more than 3 million acres of terrain that is, by definition, accessible only on foot or on horseback. There are no roads into the wilderness, a fact that provides significant protection to sites in the most remote portions of the area, since the physical effort required to reach them limits the population of potential visitors to those willing and able to undertake multi-day wilderness travel. But the most accessible sites, those within a day's hike of the wilderness boundary, including the Gila Cliff Dwellings National Monument, receive substantial visitor traffic, and managing the impact of that traffic on fragile archaeological features is a continuous management challenge. The cliff dwellings themselves, within the National Monument, are protected by active management. Visitor access is controlled. A trail system directs foot traffic through the sites in ways that minimize contact with fragile surfaces. And rangers and interpretive staff are present during visitor hours to explain the significance of the sites and to enforce the regulations that prohibit touching or removing any part of the archaeological features. The combination of controlled access and active management has been reasonably effective at protecting the main cliff-dwelling sites, though the cumulative impact of many thousands of annual visitors over many decades is not zero, and the long-term preservation of the structures requires ongoing monitoring and, where necessary, stabilization of deteriorating elements. The greater preservation challenge lies in the sites beyond the monument boundaries, the many hundreds of archaeological sites documented in the broader Gila Wilderness that are not actively managed, that receive whatever visitors arrive by chance or by design, and that are subject to all of the erosional and weathering forces that affect archaeological sites in exposed outdoor environments in a landscape of considerable climatic variation. Erosion is perhaps the most pervasive preservation challenge. The canyon soils of the Gila are thin and, in many places, easily disturbed. Where vegetation has been removed by fire, overgrazing, or foot traffic around archaeological sites, the soil that contains buried archaeological materials is exposed to rainfall and runoff that can rapidly displace and damage the archaeological record. The unconsolidated cultural deposits that accumulate over periods of human occupation, the hearth ash, the food debris, the discarded tools, and ceramic sherds that make up much of the portable archaeological record, are particularly vulnerable to erosion once the surface protection of vegetation is removed. Looting remains a persistent problem at remote archaeological sites across the American Southwest, including within the Gila Wilderness. The artifacts associated with Mogollon and ancient Pueblo sites, particularly the decorated pottery of the Mimbres tradition and related styles, have commercial value in the art and antiquities market that provides economic motivation for illegal collection. The remoteness of wilderness sites, which provides protection against casual vandalism, also limits the monitoring and law enforcement presence that might deter more determined artifact collectors. The penalties for looting on federal land are substantial. The Archaeological Resources Protection Act of 1979 established significant criminal and civil penalties for the unauthorized excavation or removal of archaeological materials from federal land. But the detection and prosecution of violations in a landscape as large and remote as the Gila Wilderness is operationally difficult. The stabilization of deteriorating cliff-dwelling architecture is a technically demanding and resource-intensive undertaking that the National Park Service and its partner organizations have conducted at the Gila Cliff Dwellings National Monument over many years. Adobe mortar, the original binding material of the cliff-dwelling walls, weathers steadily in the rain and freeze-thaw cycles of the canyon environment, and the periodic repointing of mortar joints is necessary to prevent the progressive deterioration of walls that would otherwise slowly disaggregate and collapse. The challenge of stabilization is to use materials and techniques that arrest deterioration without introducing visual or chemical incompatibilities with the original construction, a balance that requires both technical skill and a detailed understanding of the original building materials and methods. Documentation of sites before deterioration renders them unreadable is another priority of modern archaeological preservation. The systematic photogrammetric recording of cliff-dwelling architecture, using overlapping photographs to create precise three-dimensional models of standing walls, room configurations, and architectural details, provides a permanent record of features that may not survive indefinitely. This documentation does not substitute for physical preservation, but it ensures that the information contained in the architecture is not entirely lost if the physical structure eventually fails. Having examined what the archaeology of the Gila Wilderness does and does not confirm, it is worth spending time with the genuine mysteries that remain, the questions that are not manufactured for entertainment or inflated beyond the evidence, but that represent real gaps in the historical and archaeological record, real uncertainties that careful investigation has not yet resolved. These genuine mysteries are, in many ways, more interesting than the tunnel legends, because they arise from the actual complexity of the archaeological record, rather than from the desire to impose a dramatic narrative on an already remarkable landscape. The first genuine mystery is the full extent of the ancient settlement system in the Gila country. Archaeological survey of the wilderness is substantially incomplete. Many portions of the landscape have never been systematically walked by a survey team, and the sites that exist in those areas, the rock shelters, the agricultural features, the open campsites, the rock art locations, are unknown in any formal sense. Given what survey work has revealed in the portions of the wilderness that have been investigated, it is virtually certain that significant unrecorded archaeological sites exist in areas that have not been surveyed. The full picture of how the ancient communities of the Gila used their landscape, where they settled at different periods, how their settlement patterns changed over time. What parts of the terrain were most intensively used and what parts were peripheral cannot be assembled from the partial survey record currently available. The second genuine mystery involves the specific social organization of the cliff-dwelling communities. The archaeology can tell us a great deal about what people did, what they ate, what they built, what pottery they made, how they managed water, but it is considerably less informative about how they organized themselves socially. The size of the cliff-dwelling communities at the Gila sites suggests relatively small groups. The architectural evidence points to communities of perhaps a few dozen to a few hundred people, rather than the large aggregated towns of the Rio Grande period. But the internal social organization of these communities, the kinship structures, the ritual affiliations, the patterns of authority and decision-making, is not directly readable from the material record and can only be inferred with considerable uncertainty from comparative ethnographic knowledge of related living communities. The third genuine mystery concerns the specific routes and destinations of the communities that left the Gila cliff dwellings in the early 14th century. The ceramic evidence provides some general guidance. There are connections between the material culture of the Gila sites and that of later sites to the east and north, but the specific trajectories of individual community groups, the stops they made along the way, and the social processes by which they were incorporated into or established the communities at their destinations remain poorly understood. Migration in the ancient Southwest was not simply a matter of people picking up and moving from point A to point B. It was a social process, involving negotiations with communities already present at potential destinations, the establishment of new social relationships, the adjustment of cultural practices to new environmental and social contexts, and the archaeological record captures only fragments of that process. The fourth genuine mystery is the nature and extent of long-distance interaction between the Gila communities and the broader networks of exchange and communication that connected the ancient Southwest. The presence of materials from distant sources, shells from the Pacific coast and the Gulf of California, copper bells from western Mexico, macaw feathers from regions where those birds were raised, in archaeological sites across the Southwest indicates that even relatively remote communities were connected to networks that spanned enormous geographic distances. The Gila cliff-dwelling communities were not isolated. They were part of a world that extended far beyond the canyon walls of their immediate home, and the full character of their connections to that broader world is only partially recoverable from the available evidence. The fifth genuine mystery, and in some ways the most fundamental, is the inner life of the communities that inhabited the Gila Canyon, the beliefs, the ceremonies, the songs, the stories, the relationships between people, the ways they understood the world and their place within it. Archaeology can recover the material dimensions of past life with considerable sophistication, but it cannot recover the immaterial dimensions, the things that made these communities human in the fullest sense, the cultural content that gave meaning to the architecture, the pottery, the agricultural labor, and the decisions about where to live and where to go. Those dimensions of the ancient past exist, if they exist at all in recoverable form, in the oral traditions and living cultural practices of the descendant communities whose connections to the ancient Southwest are a matter of cultural continuity rather than archaeological inference. There is a specific kind of encounter that happens when a person stands before rock art in a remote canyon, an encounter that is difficult to describe because it combines intellectual curiosity with something more immediate and less articulable. The figures on the rock face are clearly the work of human hands. The pigment of the pictographs has faded to various shades of ochre and red, but the images are still legible. The outlines of animals, the geometric patterns, the human figures with their stylized limbs and ceremonial accoutrements. The petroglyphs are more durable, pecked into the rock surface with stone tools, their incised lines as crisp in some cases as the day they were made, the desert varnish that was removed by the tool still unrestored centuries later. The images are communicating something. That much is evident from the deliberateness of their placement, their composition, their relationship to each other and to the rock surface on which they appear. But what they are communicating, the specific meaning of particular figures, the purpose of their creation. The identity of the audience for whom they were intended is not generally recoverable from the images themselves, at least not with the certainty that the archaeological literature requires before a specific interpretation is offered as established fact. Rock art interpretation is one of the most methodologically challenging areas of southwestern archaeology. The images are real, often beautifully executed, clearly meaningful to the people who created them, and distributed across the Gila landscape in locations that are sometimes dramatically chosen, south-facing walls that capture the light of the winter solstice, prominent outcrops visible from a distance, sheltered alcoves where the images would be protected from the weather. The thoughtfulness of the placement is apparent even when the meaning of the images is not. Some interpretive frameworks for southwestern rock art have been developed by researchers working in consultation with indigenous communities, whose oral traditions and ceremonial practices may preserve cultural knowledge relevant to the interpretation of ancient images. The approach of rock art researchers like Polly Schaafsma, who has spent decades documenting and analyzing the rock art of the Rio Grande region and the broader Southwest, has contributed significantly to the understanding of imagery traditions and their relationships to the broader iconographic systems of ancient Southwestern cultures. This work has identified recurring imagery, the horned serpent, the masked figure, the spiral, that appears across wide areas and many time periods, suggesting that some imagery belonged to widespread symbolic traditions rather than to individual or locally specific expression. But even within this comparative and ethnographic framework, the interpretation of specific images at specific sites remains a matter of scholarly judgment and ongoing discussion rather than settled fact. The rock art of the Gila Canyon, like that of the broader Mogollon region, contains imagery that connects it to the broader Southwestern iconographic tradition, while also showing regional and temporal variation that reflects the particular cultural expression of the communities that produced it. Reading those images responsibly, taking them seriously as communication without overreaching into interpretations that the evidence cannot support, is one of the ongoing challenges of Southwestern rock art research. What the rock art definitively does not do, despite some popular interpretations, is provide a map of underground passages or a coded record of hidden chambers. The geometric patterns that appear in Southwestern rock art, spirals, grids, meanders, concentric circles, have been interpreted by some enthusiastic but methodologically unconstrained readers as schematic representations of tunnel systems or underground architecture. These interpretations are not supported by the comparative analysis of Southwestern iconography, which situates geometric imagery in a much broader context of cosmological, ritual, and astronomical symbolism that has nothing specifically to do with underground construction. The desire to read tunnel maps into ancient imagery is understandable. It would be an extraordinary thing if such maps existed, but it is not an interpretation that the evidence supports. There comes a moment in any honest engagement with a landscape as large and old and complex as the Gila Wilderness, when the questions begin to feel different from how they felt at the beginning of the inquiry. At the outset, the questions seem answerable in principle. They seem like questions that better data, more excavation, more sophisticated technology, or more careful analysis might resolve. And some of them are like that. Some of what we do not know about the Gila cliff dwellings and the communities that built them is simply a matter of insufficient investigation, and future research will fill in some of those gaps with genuine knowledge. But other questions begin to feel different as the inquiry deepens. They begin to feel less like gaps in information and more like the fundamental nature of the relationship between the present and the past, the irreducible condition of historical investigation, which is that the past is gone and what remains is always partial, always mediated, always less than the living reality that produced it. The people who built the cliff dwellings of the Gila Canyon were fully alive in every dimension that the phrase implies. They had relationships, beliefs, fears, hopes, memories, and a detailed sensory experience of the canyon world they inhabited. They knew the specific sound of the river at different water levels. They knew the quality of light in the alcoves at different times of year. They knew which plants along the canyon walls were edible and which were not, which rocks made the best building material and which crumbled too quickly, which approach to the cliff provided the most secure footing and which was treacherous after rain. None of that knowledge, that intimate, embodied, generationally accumulated knowledge of a specific landscape, is recoverable from the archaeological record. The tools, the pottery, the architectural remains, the food debris, these are the material residues of a life that was incomparably richer than any of its material dimensions alone. The archaeology tells us something real and important about those lives. It does not tell us everything, and it cannot. This recognition that the past is always partially hidden, not by conspiracy or concealment, but by the simple passage of time and the selective preservation of the material world, is, in a sense, the most genuine mystery of the Gila Wilderness. Not the tunnel legends, not the underground chamber stories, not the claims of hidden passages connecting ancient sites. The genuine mystery is the one that no amount of excavation can fully resolve, what it was like to live here in these canyons, in these alcoves, above the river. In a world defined by the particular geology and hydrology and ecology of this landscape, before any of the categories and frameworks through which we now understand it had been invented. The cliff dwellings stand as evidence of that life, fragmentary, partial, remarkable, and silent. They do not need the addition of manufactured mystery to carry their weight. The weight they carry, as the physical remains of human lives completely removed from our own world by 7 centuries of time, is already as much as most people can hold when they stand before them in the canyon light. Any account of the Gila Wilderness that does not give adequate attention to the Apache history of the region risks presenting an incomplete picture of the human landscape, one that leaps from the ancient cliff-dwelling period to the era of American wilderness designation, while skipping over a centuries-long chapter of indigenous history that shaped the character of the landscape in ways that are still relevant today. The Chiricahua Apache and the various other Apache groups who inhabited the mountain and canyon country of southwestern New Mexico and southeastern Arizona in the centuries before American military conquest, knew the Gila terrain with a depth and specificity that gave them advantages in the landscape that no outside force could easily counter. Their knowledge of water sources, which springs and seeps were reliable in drought years, which canyon systems led where which approach routes were visible from high ground and which were concealed, was accumulated over generations of inhabiting the landscape and transmitted through the oral and practical knowledge of the community. Geronimo, whose Apache name was Goyale, meaning one who yawns, was born around 1829, most likely in what is now southeastern Arizona, within the territory of the Bedonko Band of the Chiricahua Apache. His life unfolded across a period of extraordinary violence and upheaval for the Apache people, a period defined by the progressive encroachment of American military power into Apache territory, the systematic effort to confine Apache communities to reservations under conditions that were often lethal, and the protracted resistance that Geronimo and a diminishing number of followers maintained through the 1870s and 1880s. The Gila country was part of the terrain within which Geronimo and other Apache leaders operated during this period of resistance. The mountains and canyons of the wilderness, the same terrain that had sheltered the cliff-dwelling communities 6 centuries earlier, provided cover escape routes and defensible positions that gave small groups of skilled and determined Apache fighters significant tactical advantages over the larger and better-equipped American military forces that pursued them. The ability to disappear into this landscape, to use its geological complexity and its vegetational cover to evade pursuit, was not magic and required no underground tunnel network to explain. It was the product of a relationship to the landscape so intimate and so detailed that it amounted to a form of knowledge that the pursuing forces could not replicate. The famous campaigns of General George Crook and later General Nelson Miles against Geronimo and his followers in the mid-1880s involved exactly this asymmetry of landscape knowledge. American military forces, equipped with the communications technology and logistical infrastructure of the industrial era, nevertheless found themselves consistently outmaneuvered by opponents who knew the terrain in ways that maps and telescopes could not substitute for. Geronimo's final surrender in 1886, not a military defeat, but a negotiated capitulation under terms that were subsequently violated by the American government, ended the last significant armed resistance by an indigenous group to American authority in the continental United States. Geronimo spent the remainder of his life as a prisoner of war, first at Fort Pickens in Florida, then at Mount Vernon Barracks in Alabama, and finally at Fort Sill in Oklahoma, never permitted to return to the landscape of his birth and his resistance. He died at Fort Sill in 1909 at approximately 80 years of age, still technically a prisoner of war. He had used the Gila landscape with extraordinary effectiveness for years. He never saw it again after his surrender. The stories of tunnels and hidden passages in the Gila are sometimes connected, in popular legend, to the Apache use of the landscape. The idea that the disappearances that frustrated American military pursuit were the result of literal underground escape routes rather than superior terrain knowledge and tactical skill. This connection reflects a misunderstanding of what the Apache actually did and how they did it, but it also reflects, in a distorted way, a genuine reality, that the Apache relationship to the Gila landscape was so thorough and so effective that it seemed, to outside observers unfamiliar with the terrain, almost supernatural. The landscape itself was the Apache advantage. It required no embellishment. The afternoon light in the Gila Canyon moves in a particular way, not the broad, even illumination of open country, but the directed, angled light of a narrow space. Entering from above and from the canyon opening, striking the cliff faces at angles that shift steadily as the sun moves through its arc. In the morning, the eastern walls catch the light first, and the west-facing alcoves, many of which contain cliff-dwelling rooms, are in shadow, their interiors cool and dim, while the canyon floor below begins to warm. As the morning progresses and the sun rises higher, the light enters the canyon more directly, reaching surfaces that the low-angle morning light could not touch. By midday, the canyon is at its brightest, the light reflected from the pale, tough walls filling the space with a warmth that the canyon shadow and the river cold had moderated in the earlier hours. In the afternoon, the western walls begin to shade, and the eastern cliff faces, now in direct sunlight, take on a quality of color that the morning light did not produce. The tough walls, which appear pale and almost white in diffuse light, warm toward gold and ochre as the afternoon sun strikes them at a lower angle. The shadowed alcoves high in the cliff face hold the remains of their ancient rooms in the particular quality of shade that deep overhangs create, a shade that is not entirely dark because the reflected light from the canyon walls and floor still reaches it. But that is sheltered enough to feel distinctly different from the open sunlight below. The ancient builders of the cliff dwellings were attuned to these light patterns in ways that their architecture reflects. The placement of rooms within alcoves that caught winter sunlight when warmth was most needed, while the overhanging tuff provided summer shade when coolness was most valued, shows an awareness of solar geometry that was practical and deliberate. This solar orientation was not a spiritual mystery or a lost technology. It was the rational application of careful observation to the problem of building comfortable shelter in a climate of significant temperature variation. Standing in the canyon below the dwellings and looking up at the alcoves, the carefully laid stone walls, the dark openings of doorways, the smoke-stained ceiling of the natural rock shelter above the architecture, it is possible to imagine, in a general way, what life in this place may have felt like. The river sound is present, the quiet, continuous sound of moving water that would have been the background of daily life for the people who lived here. The canyon walls create a sense of enclosure that is not oppressive, but that gives the space a defined and intimate character quite different from the open landscape above. The smell of the canyon, stone, water, vegetation, the particular scent of a shaded rocky environment is present and specific and unlike the smell of any other kind of place. These sensory impressions are not archaeological evidence. They are the present experience of a place whose ancient atmosphere can only be partly recovered from the physical record. But they suggest something of the quality of the environment that shaped daily life in the Gila cliff dwellings, an environment that was demanding in its physical requirements, but that also offered a sensory richness and intimate relationship with the geological and ecological features of the canyon that a more conventional settlement on flat ground could not have provided. Throughout this journey through the Gila Wilderness, two kinds of mystery have been present, and it is worth, in the penultimate stage of the journey, being explicit about the difference between them. The first kind of mystery is manufactured, the mystery of alleged tunnel networks and secret underground chambers, of hidden passage systems connecting ancient sites across the wilderness, of enormous subterranean spaces constructed by the cliff-dwelling communities for purposes that conventional archaeology has failed to recognize. This kind of mystery is appealing because it promises something extraordinary, a hidden dimension of the past commensurate with the dramatic landscape, a secret large enough to justify the scale of the wilderness that contains it. But the appeal of this kind of mystery is not the same as its validity. The archaeological record of the Gila Wilderness does not support the existence of extensive, deliberately constructed tunnel networks. The geological conditions of the region explain the natural underground features that exist, the fractures, the voids, the lava tube remnants, the solution features insoluble rock without requiring the addition of deliberate construction. The historical accounts that contribute to tunnel legends, when examined carefully, reflect the imprecise language of casual observers encountering geological features rather than the documented discoveries of systematic investigation. And the modern investigative technologies that have been applied to various southwestern sites have not produced evidence for the kinds of underground architectural complexes that the tunnel legends describe. The responsible position, and it is a position that respects both the genuine complexity of the archaeological record and the intelligence of the audience engaging with it, is that the tunnel legends of the Gila are not established fact. They are stories. They are culturally interesting stories, shaped by the landscape, by the history of the region, by the human tendency to imagine hidden significance in ancient and remote places. But they are not what they claim to be, and treating them as though they are would be a disservice to the actual history of the people who lived in this canyon and to the legitimate science that has worked to understand that history. The second kind of mystery, the genuine mystery, is different in character and more deeply interesting. It arises not from the desire to add something dramatic to the story, but from the honest recognition of what the evidence cannot tell us. The full social life of the cliff-dwelling communities, the specific meanings of the rock art, the details of the routes followed by the departing communities, the exact timeline of the occupation, and the precise conditions of the departure. The complete biological inventory of the ancient landscape and how it compared to the landscape today. The internal experience, the beliefs, the stories, the relationships of people for whom the canyon was not a historical curiosity, but simply home. These genuine mysteries are not resolvable by claiming to have found tunnels. They require the patient, careful, methodologically rigorous work of archaeology, ethnography, oral history, and geological science, work that proceeds slowly, that acknowledges its limitations, and that builds understanding incrementally rather than proclaiming revelations. The results of that work are less dramatic than tunnel legends. They are also more real, more durable, and more genuinely interesting to anyone willing to engage with the complexity of the past on its own terms. Evening comes to the Gila Wilderness in stages. The canyon floors darken first, as the sun falls below the canyon rim while the sky above is still fully lit. In this intermediate state, the canyon holds a quality of light that does not quite belong to either day or night, an interior dimness, while the high cliff faces and the ridge tops above catch the last direct light of the afternoon and glow with a warmth that the canyon shadow below cannot reach. The river in the valley bottom reflects this complexity of light, catching brightness from the still-lit sky above while its banks are already in the deepening shadow of the canyon walls. Higher up the slopes, in the ponderosa forest above the canyon rim, the light lasts longer. The trees hold the afternoon sun on their rough orange bark, and the understory between the trunks fills with a golden quality that is particular to pine forests in the late afternoon, a light that seems to have a physical weight to it, that settles into the spaces between the trees and makes the forest feel enclosed and intimate despite the openness of the canopy above. On the high ridges, the light lasts longest of all. The summit rocks hold the warmth of the sun through the final stages of the afternoon. And the view from the highest points in the wilderness, across the successive ridges and canyons of the Mogollon Mountains, toward the distant flatlands of the Chihuahuan Desert to the south and east, is illuminated at that hour by a light that brings out the full depth and color of the landscape in a way that the flat light of midday does not. And then the light goes, and the wilderness enters its night. The night sky above the Gila Wilderness is one of the darkest in the continental United States, a consequence of the remoteness of the area from major population centers and the resulting absence of light pollution across the enormous uninhabited distances in every direction. On a clear night, the Milky Way is visible not as a faint smudge on the horizon, but as a bright and fully detailed band of light across the entire sky. Structured and dense and complex in a way that is only apparent when the surrounding darkness is deep enough to allow the full resolution of the galactic structure to become perceptible. The ancient communities of the Gila lived under this sky every night. The patterns of the stars, their seasonal movements, their rising and setting positions, their relationship to the agricultural and ceremonial calendar, would have been far more familiar to them than they are to most contemporary people, whose experience of the night sky is filtered through the ambient light of the modern-built environment, the astronomical awareness that is evident in many ancient southwestern architectural alignments, the solar orientations of rooms, the positioning of features to capture the light of solstice and equinox events, reflects a long and careful engagement with the sky that was both practical and almost certainly culturally and spiritually significant. The cliff dwellings are empty now. The rooms that held hearth fires and sleeping bodies, food stores and ceramic vessels, the material equipment of daily life in a specific time and place, all of that is gone. What remains are the walls, some of them still standing to roof height, and the natural alcoves in the tuff that sheltered the architecture, and the canyon around the alcoves, and the river below, and the mountains above, and the sky. The mountains especially remain. The Mogollon Mountains that define the landscape of the Gila Wilderness were old before the cliff-dwelling communities arrived, and they are unchanged in any meaningful geological sense since those communities departed. The volcanic geology that created the canyon walls and the alcoves and the building material of the dwellings is the same geology that was present when the first stones were laid and when the last person walked away. The geological time within which the human story of the Gila is contained is so much longer than the human story itself that the ruins, remarkable as they are, read against that timescale as a very brief inscription in a very long document. There is a quality of silence in the deep wilderness of the Gila that is not simply the absence of sound. It is, rather, the presence of the sounds that have always been there, the sounds that the noise of modern human infrastructure has trained us not to hear because it consistently overwhelms them. The movement of wind through pine needles, which has a particular sound depending on the intensity of the wind and the density of the canopy. The irregular percussion of a woodpecker working a dead tree somewhere in the middle distance, the sound carrying in the still air with a clarity that would be impossible in a noisier environment. The creek water moving over its stones, its sound varying with the depth and speed of the current, with the particular arrangement of rocks in each stretch of streambed. These sounds were present in this landscape when the cliff-dwelling communities inhabited the canyon alcoves. They were present before that, when no human ear was here to receive them, and they will be present after whatever human chapter follows our own has concluded, and the wilderness has settled back into whatever state the future holds for it. The sounds of the Gila are not background. They are the actual sound of the place, the continuous acoustic expression of the geological and ecological processes that are always underway in this landscape. The ruins participate in the silence in their own way, the cliff-dwelling walls standing in their alcoves above the river do not produce sound except when the wind moves across them and finds the small gaps and hollows that weathering has created in the masonry, producing a faint and irregular note that is not quite music and not quite speech, but that is audible in the right conditions to a person standing close and listening carefully. This is not the voice of the ancient inhabitants, despite what a romantically inclined imagination might suggest. It is simply the physics of wind moving across an irregular solid surface. But the coincidence of that sound with a site of such evident human significance creates an experience that is not easily forgotten. The pottery sherds that lie on the surface of many Gila sites, the fragments of ceramic vessels broken in the course of ordinary life centuries ago, lying where they fell or where subsequent erosion has carried them, are similarly quiet in a way that feels almost paradoxical. They are the most direct physical connection available to the daily life of the people who inhabited this landscape. Someone made them, someone used them. Someone at some point dropped or broke them, and the fragments that resulted from that ancient moment of ordinary damage have been lying in this canyon ever since, through 7 centuries of weathering and erosion and the gradual accumulation of the distance between then and now. They do not speak. They simply exist, as all material things exist, present, specific, and silent about the human context that produced them. Reading them requires the particular skills and knowledge of archaeology, and even with those skills, what can be known from a potsherd is limited. Its clay source, sometimes. Its firing temperature, approximately. Its stylistic affiliation, often. The hands that shaped it, the mouth that drank from the vessel it was part of, those things are not recoverable, and the silence that surrounds them is the silence of genuine historical distance. The Gila Wilderness does not care about the stories told about it. This is not a cynical observation. It is simply a recognition of the relationship between landscape and narrative, between the thing itself and the various human attempts to give it meaning. The mountains stand at their elevations regardless of what is written about them. The river follows its canyon regardless of what legends are attached to it. The cliff dwellings hold their walls against the slow pressure of weathering regardless of whether the theories proposed to explain them are accurate or fanciful. The landscape is indifferent to interpretation, not hostile to it, not dismissive of it, simply indifferent, in the way that geological time is indifferent to the particular events that unfold within it. The human need to make sense of the landscape, to story it, to find within its features the evidence of hidden significance. This need is real and deeply understandable. It is part of how human beings relate to the world they inhabit, part of the cognitive and emotional architecture that has always driven the production of meaning in the face of complexity and uncertainty. What distinguishes responsible storytelling from irresponsible storytelling? What distinguishes the kind of engagement with the past that this documentary has attempted from the kind that the tunnel legends represent is not the presence or absence of imagination. Both require imagination. The difference is the relationship between imagination and evidence. Responsible engagement with historical and archaeological evidence uses imagination to fill in the human dimensions of a record that is inevitably incomplete, to reconstruct, with appropriate care and explicit uncertainty, the context and experience of past lives that the material record can only partially reveal. Irresponsible engagement uses imagination to replace evidence with wish fulfillment, to substitute dramatic narratives for careful analysis, to treat the landscape as a stage for stories that its actual history does not support. The Gila Wilderness, understood honestly through its geology, its archaeology, its indigenous history, its ecological dynamics, its genuine uncertainties, is a more interesting place than any tunnel legend makes it. It is a place where some of the most sophisticated ancient communities in North America built remarkable architecture in a challenging landscape, adapted to conditions of considerable difficulty, with intelligence and skill, and eventually moved on in the way that communities across the ancient Southwest moved in response to the pressures of their time. It is a place where the Apache people demonstrated, in the 19th century, what it means to know a landscape with the intimacy that can only come from generations of inhabiting it. It is a place where the federal government made in 1924 a decision that has preserved a significant piece of the American wild for a century of visitors, researchers, and simply the continued existence of the plants and animals and geological processes that have nothing to do with human decisions, but that depend on the consequences of those decisions. And it is a place where in the canyon alcoves above the river, the stone walls of the cliff dwellings continue their slow dialogue with time, held up by the geological patience of the tuff that surrounds them. Worn by the rain and the wind and the freeze-thaw cycles of a climate that has no awareness of their significance, standing as long as the physics of stone and mortar allow them to stand and then not standing. Let the landscape settle now. The wilderness is quiet in the way that only genuinely remote places are quiet, a quiet that is not empty but full of the sounds it has always contained, the sounds that belong to the place itself rather than to the human presence within it. The canyon walls hold the last warmth of the day in their stone, the tuff that was once volcanic ash, deposited in an eruption that no human being witnessed, shaped by millions of years of the river's work into the particular cliffs and alcoves that the canyon presents today. The stone is warm to the touch in the evening, holding the heat of the afternoon in a way that makes the canyon feel inhabited even when no one is there. The river moves through the canyon in the darkness, finding its way over the stones of its bed by the same physical logic that has always guided it. The logic of gravity and hydraulics of water seeking the lowest available path through the landscape, wearing the rock it crosses by the patient repetition of its movement. The river does not know about the cliff dwellings above it. It does not know about the communities that drew water from it for generations, that built their lives in the alcoves above its banks, that watched its floods with the careful attention of people whose agriculture depended on managing what the flood delivered and removed. The river simply moves, as it has moved for far longer than any of that human history, in the dark canyon between the patient walls. The ancient rooms above the river are dark tonight, as they have been dark on most nights since the early 14th century. The doorways that once framed the light of interior fires now frame nothing. The interiors of the rooms are as dark as the canyon around them, the darkness within continuous with the darkness without. The walls stand in their alcoves, maintaining their arrangement against the slow dissolution of time. And the canyon receives them in the same way it receives the river and the forest and the stars above, without comment, without acknowledgement, in the geological silence that is the deepest and most enduring quality of this landscape. The human story that unfolded here, the generations of careful observation, the architecture designed to last, the agriculture adapted to the canyon's particular hydrology, the community life with its relationships and its rituals and its accumulated knowledge of this specific piece of the world, all of that is present in the canyon in the way that the past is always present, invisibly, incompletely, expressed in traces that require knowledge and patience and the willingness to attend carefully to evidence before they begin to speak. What the canyon holds is not a tunnel system or a hidden chamber or a subterranean map to lost treasure. What it holds is something older and more durable than any of those things. It holds the evidence of human adaptation, of people meeting a demanding landscape with intelligence and skill, and a depth of engagement with the natural world that the modern built environment rarely requires or produces. It holds the record of communities that knew this canyon in ways we can only partially reconstruct, who found in it what they needed to sustain their lives, and who eventually moved on to other places and other challenges, leaving their architecture behind in the volcanic cliffs above the river. That evidence, partial, silent, beautiful in its incompleteness, is enough. It is more than enough if we are willing to engage with it honestly and with the patience it deserves. The wilderness remains. The canyon holds its walls. The river moves through the dark. And somewhere above the Ponderosa ridges the stars of the Gila night come out one by one, indifferent and ancient, and exact the same stars that the cliff-dwelling communities watched from their alcoves on clear winter nights. Before the fires were banked and the canyon fell quiet and the darkness settled over everything that has ever happened here, let them carry you quietly into sleep. The mountains are still standing, the old stone walls are still standing. And the river, patient as time itself, is still finding its way through the canyon, gently and without end.